So this is part A of the Khoodeelaar television channel being broadcast under the banner of Baby Angel Geronimo editions. This is 5th of May, and this is noting the gunpowder plot of 1605 that was an incompetent, weak, and timid response by the Catholics to the anti Catholic hostility and hatred of the English King James I. The hundreds of years that have passed since then (418 years, in fact) have been predominantly spent in referring to the 5th of November in a most misleading and false way, and some typically Little English kind of so-called rebels have exaggerated the importance of the gunpowder plot to suggest that it was a conspiracy against Parliament. Some have even gone to the extent of saying that it was a movement against the corruption of the British Parliament. 418 years have gone, and there has been nothing, absolutely nothing. I'm not talking about the physical repetition of the gunpowder like plot. Even intellectually and morally, there has been nothing that has even resembled a discussion, a coherent discussion about the evidence that persists of the British Parliament being a corrupt parliament, an absolutely unjust, anti-democratic, unaccountable parliament. And the little bits of resistance, like the Peterloo resistance in the Manchester area, let's check. The Peterloo massacre took place at St. Peter's Field, Manchester, Lancashire, England, on Monday, the 16th of August, 1819. 18 people died and 400 to 700 were injured when cavalry charged into a crowd of around 60,000 people who had gathered to demand the reform of parliamentary representation. After the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, there was an acute economic slump accompanied by chronic unemployment and harvest failure due to the year without a summer, and worsened by the corn laws, which kept the price of bread high At that time, only around 11% of adult males had the vote, very few of them in the industrial north of England, which was worst hit. Reformers identified parliamentary reform as the solution, and a mass campaign to petition Parliament for manhood suffrage gained three-quarters of a million signatures in 1817, but was flatly rejected by the House of Commons. So you see, the point I made about the British Parliament being corrupt is recognized in what the House of Commons did in rejecting the petition, three-quarters of a million signature petition in 1817. When a second slump occurred in early 1819, radical reformers sought to mobilize huge crowds to force the government to back down. The movement was particularly strong in the Northwest, where the Manchester Patriotic Union organized a mass rally in August 1819, addressed by well known radical orator Henry Hunt. Shortly after the meeting began, local magistrates called on the Manchester and Salford yeomanry to arrest Hunt and several others on the platform with him. The yeomanry charged into the crowd, knocking down a woman and killing a child, and finally apprehended Hunt. Cheshire Magistrates Chairman William Hulton then summoned the 15th Hussars to disperse the crowd. They charged with sabres drawn, and contemporary accounts estimated that between 9 and 17 people were killed and 400 to 700 injured in the ensuing confusion. The event was first labeled the Peterloo Massacre by the radical Manchester Observer newspaper in a bitterly ironic reference to the bloody Battle of Waterloo, which had taken place 4 years earlier. Historian Robert Poole has called the Peterloo Massacre the bloodiest political event of the 19th century in England, in English soil, and a political earthquake in the northern powerhouse of the Industrial Revolution. The London and national papers shared the horror felt in Manchester region, but Peterloo's immediate effect was to cause the government to pass the Six Acts, which were aimed at suppressing any meetings for the purpose of radical reform. It also led intercity, I'll read that again. It also led indirectly to the foundation of the Manchester Guardian newspaper. In a survey conducted by the Guardian, the modern iteration of the Manchester Guardian, in 2006, Peterloo came second to the Putney debates as the event from radical British history, the most proper monument or a memorial. For some time, Peterloo was commemorated only by a blue plaque, criticized as being inadequate and referring only to the dispersal by the military of an assembly. In 2007, the City Council replaced the blue plaque with a red plaque referring to peaceful rally being attacked by armed cavalry and mentioning 15 deaths and over 600 injuries. In 2019, the 200th anniversary of the massacre, Manchester City Council inaugurated a new Peterloo Memorial by the artist Jeremy Della, featuring 11 concentric circles of local stone engraved with the names of the dead and the places from which the victims came. So, the background, the main article on Reformed House of Commons. In 1819, Lancashire was represented by two county members of parliament MPs, and a further 12 borough members sitting for the towns of Clitheroe, Newton, Wigan, Lancaster, Liverpool, and Preston, with a total of 17,000 voters in a country population of nearly 1 million. Thanks to deals by Whig and Tory parties to carve up the seats between them, most had not seen a contested election within living memory. Nationally, the so called rotten boroughs had a hugely disproportionate influence on the membership of the Parliament of the United Kingdom compared to the size of their populations. Old Sarum in Wiltshire, with one voter, elected two MPs, as did Dunwich in Suffolk, which by the early 19th century had almost completely disappeared into the sea. The major urban centres of Manchester, Salford, Bolton, Blackburn, Rochdale, Ashton under Lyne, Oldham, and Stockport had no MPs of their own and only a few hundred country voters. By comparison, more than half of all MPs were returned by a total of just 154 owners of rotten or closed boroughs. In 1816, Thomas Oldfield's The Representative History of Great Britain and Ireland, being a history of the House of Commons and the counties, cities, and boroughs of the United Kingdom from the earliest period, claimed that of the 515 MPs for England and Wales, 351 were returned by the patronage of 117 individuals and a further 16 by the direct patronage of the government. All 45 Scottish MPs owed their seats to patronage. These inequalities in political representation led to calls for reform. Now, obviously, reforms have not happened. And despite the fact that the despite the fact that this has been mentioned as part of what is effectively countable as a democratic movement, there has been no real change in the undemocratic nature and composition and constitution of the House of Commons. And so, 418 years on, after the Peterloo massacre, the United Kingdom remains undemocratic and the parliament remains completely corrupt. And despite the fact that the Guardian was the product or a product of the massacre and the outrage felt by the people in the Manchester area, the Guardian itself has not performed even 5% of the pro democratic auditing of the House of Commons or the government or of the monarchy. Now, this was happening in 418 years ago. That was the gunpowder plot, and the Peterloo massacre happened. Let's go back to the actual date of the Peterloo massacre again, because so the Peterloo massacre happened on the 1819, which is 1819 is how long? 1819 So, 62 years after the Peterloo massacre, well, 62 years before the Peterloo massacre, the East India Company achieved something that was absolutely not evident in England itself. It acquired the route to the British Empire after successfully bribing the traitor, the general of Nawab Sirajuddaullah's realm, Mir Zafar Ali Khan. So, what the British Empire in 1757 symbolized was something that was not happening in England itself. What a remarkable thing! What an absolutely remarkable thing. And the people of the subcontinent, how many people were there in the subcontinent in 1757? Let's check how many people there were. The period of almost continuous warfare that accompanied the establishment of the British Empire in India between 1756 and 1818 seriously affected the population in almost every major region of India. Thus, the baseline population in 1757 was probably about 180 million for the subcontinent as a whole. So, 180 million people in 1757. Now, how many people were there in England? In England, 1757 in Great Britain. Events from the year 1757 in Great Britain, other year 1755, 1756. So, how many people were there? Okay. So, what was the population of England in 1750? About 5.75 million people. Now, look at that. 5.75 million people. Let's say 6 million. So, 180 divided by 6. Now, the population of the subcontinent as a whole was 30 times that of the entire population of England in 1750s. 30 times. And yet only a handful of people from England managed to lie, to deceive, and corrupt their way into taking over Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa and defeat Sirajuddaulah and pave the way for the takeover of the British Empire. Empire, creation, foundation of the British Empire. So, what was the intellectual abilities of these people? Did the 180 million people include, contain enough intellectual, enough numbers of people, if you like, with intellectual capacity and foresight to see what was happening? So it is as absolutely amazing kind of correspondence, if you like. What was happening in England in the 1750s and onwards for 190 years, and what happened in the subcontinent during that period. More things were happening in the subcontinent which was being looted and robbed and occupied and exploited and abused by these little Englanders numerically. What are the things that are to be listed? One is the Waterloo massacre, and go back to the 14th century peasants' revolt. Peasants' revolt is a 14th century depiction of William Walworth. Remember Walworth? There is a place in Southwark called Walworth. That is after the killing of Wat Tyler. How many died in the peasants' revolt? As the uprising spread, some peasant groups organized armies. Although the revolt was supported by Hardrick Zwingli and Thomas Munzer, its condemnation by Martin Luther contributed to its defeat, principally by the army of the Swabian League. Some 100,000 peasants were killed. So it was 1381, wasn't it? The peasants' revolt of England. 1381. So the peasants' revolt happened in 1381. In 1381, peasants rebelled against King Richard II. The peasants were angry about a range of issues, such as low pay and the introduction of a poll tax. The demanded changes were made. The revolt did not achieve all of the peasants' aims, and the leader, Wat Tyler, was killed. Okay. Wat Tyler is the protagonist of the penny dreadful serial. Oh, this is not the same Wat Tyler, is it? Wat Tyler of the. So there is not a lot of rebellion happening in England. It was a very small population compared to the population of the subcontinent of India, and it was backward. It was lagging behind in almost everything, every aspect of democracy and awareness. And yet, a sample of people, a small number of people from this population managed to managed to take over by deception, by bribery and corruption, a route to what became the empire, British Empire. And even when the 1857 attempt to overthrow the growing British Empire, when that was attempted, what was happening in England itself again? Let's check. So on the 29th of July, no, 3rd of July, the Kohinoor diamond stolen from India is presented to Queen Victoria. That is 1850 in the United Kingdom. So you've got England losing the colony in the USA, United States in America, and expanding, looting and robbing the empire in the subcontinent of India. So England was just a very small, demographically very small, politically very small, but in terms of plotting and conspiracy and greed and lack of any concern for the people of the subcontinent, it was way, way out of all proportion to the numbers. And despite the limitations, in 1846 to 1860, the cholera pandemic, like the COVID 19, claims 52,000 lives in England and Wales between 1848 and 1850. In 2 years, Elizabeth Barrett Browning's collection, Sonnets from the Portuguese, containing the well known poem which begins, How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. And Charles Dickens' novel, David Copperfield, complete in book form, and Alfred Tennyson's poem, In Memoriam, A.H.H., William Wordsworth's poem, The Prelude, or Growth of a Poet's Mind Posthumously, the Charm periodical of the Pre Raphaelite Brotherhood, edited by William Michael Rosset, 4 issues, January to April. The last two titled Art and Poetry. So Darwin is born on the 15th of January. So altogether, there have been only a handful of events. After the murder of Wat Tyler, 1381 time ago, peasants revolt, and it wasn't. So that was 1381 peasants revolt, and again the Peterloo massacre. So the Peterloo massacre happened on the 16th of August, 1819. So that's a long time ago. 438 years between 1381 and 1819. And the Guy Fawkes, the gunpowder plot was not really an English one, it was an England based Catholics' revolt against the English king, James I. So if you take out the gunpowder plot, then you wait for another 100 years. The popular councillors. So you've got popular councillors, Peterloo in Manchester, and then peasants' revolt in London. These are the three things in the so more than 500 years. It's more than 500 years from the peasants' revolt of 1381. Just look at the complete backwardness politically, the timidity, the fear, and the lack of organization. So when the Daily Mail publishes the attack on the United Nations by the criminal, Scottish born criminal, liar Andrew Neil, or it carries the congenital liar Boris Johnson's attack on the incumbent in the post of mayor at the expense of London, Sadiq Khan, in dealing with crime in London. The Daily Mail is lying. And there is no real frame of reference whatsoever for objectively, in, independently looking at the movement for democracy in England, for accountability in England. So there was a complete, absolute shell. England didn't actually exist in England. England didn't actually exist in England. England existed in America. England existed in India, the subcontinent, and England existed in Australia. Let's see what happened in Australia. And then we can see so Australia, the European name for mainland Australia was New Holland. With a land size of 7,682,300 square meters, Australia is only slightly smaller than the United States. It is the smallest continent on our planet and the sixth largest country. The United States is the fourth largest country in the world. The land that is now known as Australia was called by various names by the indigenous people who lived there for thousands of years before the arrival of Europeans. These names varied between different language groups and regions. The indigenous peoples had a deep spiritual connection to the land and had a name for every feature of the land. For many centuries, Europeans believed there must be a vast land in the southern hemisphere, variously called terra australis incognitia or unknown Southland. After Dutch navigators charted the northern, western, and southern coasts of Australia during the 17th century, this newly found continent became known as New Holland. It was the English explorer Matthew Flinders who suggested the name we use today. He was the first to circumnavigate the continent in 1803 and used the name Australia to describe the continent on a land drawn map in 18. I'll read that again. Matthew Flinders used the name Australia to describe the continent on a hand drawn map in 1804. The National Library holds a reproduction. When the map and book describing the journey was finally published in 1814, the name Terra Australia was used. Instead, although Flinders stated that his preference was still Australia, you can view his general chart of Terra Australia, Terra Australis, or Australia map online. The New South Wales governor, Lachlan Macquarie, endorsed the name Australia to replace New Holland in a dispatch to the Colonial Office in London in December 1817, and the name came into common local usage. By 1824, the British Admiralty started to officially use the name, and the term Australia was first used in British legislation in 1824-28 to apply to the two colonies of New South Wales and Van Diemen's land combined. The name Commonwealth of Australia for the nation of six federated colonies was formalized in the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act 1900, Preamble Section 3, passed by the UK Parliament. The name Australia had appeared in print long before Flinders' suggestion, but only broadly applied to the legendary southern landmass. The earliest printing of this name is in an astronomical treatise published in 1545, with south at the top of the map, head map, a small wind head map names the imagined southern landmass Australia. The State Library of South Australia has an excellent overview of Flinders' naming of Australia on other website encountering 1802 to 2002, etc., etc. So all the activities were happening outside of England, far away from Europe. Australia was the farthest. India was the next farthest. And then, of course, it was America. So, England, which was the supplier of the demographic contents, was small in every sense, except that its ambition and its greed exceeded thousands of times its capacity and its actual remit internally, locally, domestically, in England itself. How did these people manage to do this? The fact that they actually spread, physically spread their tentacles and their grabbing of these three continents. One, India, let's say, is part of a big part of the continent of Asia, the biggest continent on the planet. Then Australia, a continent by itself. Australia, a continent in its own right. And America, big part, the biggest part of the continent of the North America. These three continents were controlled for significant periods by people from England. Think about that. And England wasn't moving towards democracy, towards accountability, towards justice whatsoever. What England was doing was concentrating power, concentrating denials and lies and corruption. Now, if we add the events of the gunpowder plot of the 5th of November, 1605, you have a dimension that just about suggests, it doesn't actually assert, but it suggests the possibility of what could be done for democracy, for getting rid of the corrupt institution called the English Parliament. So, if you look at the list of these events, so you've got 1605, 1920s, 1890s, 1605, and 1381. So, the difference between the 1920s and the Peterloo is 100 years. And the difference between Peterloo and the gunpowder plot (200 years). And the difference between the gunpowder plot and the peasants' revolt of London is 300 years, let's say. So you've got difference of 100 years between the Peterloo revolt and the popular councillors' revolt, and the difference between Peterloo and the gunpowders was 200 years. And the difference between the peasants' revolt and the gunpowder plot, 300 years. Hundreds of years have passed between every two significant event. And these are too infrequent on the English soil, England soil. Whereas the English, very small numbers of the English demography spreading into America and in Australia and in the Indian subcontinent were influencing way too disproportionate numbers and magnitude of events. So there is absolutely nothing that the congenital liar Boris Johnson, the criminal, the congenital liar and crook Andrew Neil, the congenital liar and criminal, Nigel Lye's son, Dominic Lye's son, or the congenital liar and criminal, Howard Jacobson, or Jeremy Clarkson, or Pierce Moron, or the political murderer of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer. None of these criminals has actually any basis, any connection with any basis, any foundation, any actual event, any actual history or linked series of events that any of these criminals can cite or refer to as showing a consistent, original foundation, original tradition for democracy, for the access to universality. So, all of these limitations are fundamental limitations, and the fact that the popular councillors were sent to jail and the Peterloo protesters were murdered, massacred, and injured, and the peasant revolt leader was murdered, and the gunpowder plot, of course, was foiled. All of these point domestically about England to a persistent pattern of repression, oppression, non democracy, anti democracy, lack of democracy. And this is continuing, persisting to this day, 5th of November 2023. Against all of these negatives, we update with the narrative Baby Angel Geronimo editions. Baby Angel Geronimo essay, Baby Angel Geronimo witness. Baby Angel Geronimo's commentary is based on the evidence of the behavior of the corruption, the prostitution, the distortion, the deviation, the falsehood called the High Court Judge Griffiths, the High Court Judge Murray. These criminals completely deny the existence of the concepts underlying universal, objective rule of law, due process, fairness, and justice. When the criminal Andrew evilness Neil decries the United Nations, what he forgets is that an objective examination of his criminality, it appears that without the existence of the movement at that time that it existed, the foundation of the United Nations in the 1940s, there would be nothing. There would be nothing by way of constitutional framework for providing a guidance and then route away from the darkness that is England, that has been England. Although a number of people who took part in the actual foundation, the writing of the founding aims and objects of the United Nations in the 1940s came from England. They did that individually, they didn't do that collectively. They did that individually and without an integrated, consolidated, united continuation from anything in the past, because nothing in the past actually existed. So if you go back to the 1381 revolt by the peasants, so that is the 14th century, the 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. So for 700 years in England, there was no real continuation to democracy, towards democracy. And that explains why the councillors in Poplar, compared to the population in the whole of England at the time in the 1920s, the small number of councillors in the Poplar Borough Council did something that showed what should have been happening but wasn't happening. That is to say, the stand that they took, the stand that the Poplar councillors took in defending some of the most disadvantaged and economically disadvantaged people in all of England, the stand should have been evident in other parts of England. And the stand should have been taken by the corresponding councillors in place in other parts of England at the time. But as the history shows, the House of Commons is not rich democratic parliament. The House of Commons is even now still incomplete and unrepresentative of the democratic demography that exists in the population, but it is not adequately representative of the people in the country of England. Everything, including the current regime fronted by Rishi Sunak, aided and abetted by the criminals, featured in the list of criminals are the likes of Suella, Ivila, Cruella Fernandez. These are elements that contradict democracy. They poison democracy. They contaminate the political, democratic environment, and they convey the message of denying the aims and objects of the founding aims and objects of the United Nations organization of the 1940s. When the main broadcasting vehicle, the BBC, was founded, the BBC was founded as an internally imperialistic colonizing for propaganda, not for telling the truth, for propaganda and control. So if the people in the colonized places like the what became the United States of America looked for remedies, rectification, correction, and liberation from the British descended occupiers of the continental USA, there was no destination that they could aim to address their pleas, address their demands. So the independence that the USA became, the independent state, United States, although helped, significantly helped in the articulation, arguments by the lone Englishmen who took part there and who also ironically took part in the revolution in France. Think about that. The only Englishman, the only member of the population in England who had any sense of democracy, of liberation, of freedom, didn't find a single ally in England itself. He found allies and followers in France as well as in the USA. That shows the stark poverty, intellectual poverty, democratic poverty, ethical poverty in England. That is historic, but that is contemporary as well. As of this date, Sunday, the 5th of November, 2023. So when baby angel Geronimo was targeted for vilification, targeted for defamation, targeted for harassment, targeted for being hurt, for being innocent, it was behalf of baby angel Geronimo to the holders of positions like the office of prime minister, like the office or offices of the high court judges. These pleas could not be really materialized. These could not be realized because there was no history, there was no record, there was no precedent for justice. So the precedent in the England Parliament and English system was an unjust precedent or a series of unjust precedents, examples, evidence, records. So this is an extended introduction to the lack of democracy and lack of justice led by the baby angel Geronimo's editions. This is part A of the Khoodeelaar television channel. Ending this particular part of the introduction, 1 hour, 12 minutes at 0642 hours GMT on Sunday, the 5th of November 2023.